The gaslight flickered against the rain-slicked cobblestones of Mayfair as Alexander Sinclair, Duke of Pemberton, adjusted his silk top hat and stepped from his midnight blue carriage. At 32, he possessed the kind of aristocratic bearing that commanded attention in any drawing-room. Tall, broad-shouldered, with steel-gray eyes that missed nothing and dark hair that refused to stay perfectly groomed despite his valet's best efforts. Tonight, however, his usual air of confident authority was tempered by a grim determination that had been building for weeks. The exclusive gentlemen's club before him, Whitmore's, glowed with warm amber light behind its Georgian windows. Inside, he knew, the cream of London society would be nursing their brandies and discussing matters of import, trade, politics, the occasional scandal. But Alexander's interest this evening centred on one man in particular, Lord Reginald Ashworth, Earl of Blackmore, his long-time rival in both business and society. 4 months, Alexander had watched with growing suspicion as Ashworth's wealth seemed to multiply at an impossible rate. While other peers struggled with the economic uncertainties of the 1880s, Ashworth had purchased 3 new estates, commissioned a yacht, and threw lavish parties that rivaled those of royalty. His explanations, successful investments in railroad ventures and colonial enterprises, had satisfied most of society, but Alexander's keen business mind detected inconsistencies. The breakthrough had come 3 weeks ago when Alexander's trusted man of affairs, Thompson, had uncovered a series of peculiar transactions. Warehouses registered under shell companies, shipments arriving at odd hours, and most telling of all, connections to known dealers in contraband goods. The evidence pointed to an elaborate smuggling operation dealing in opium from the Orient, fine tobaccos from the Americas, and premium cigars, all avoiding the Crown's hefty taxes and import restrictions. Alexander had spent the last fortnight gathering irrefutable proof. Tonight, he carried in his breast pocket a leather portfolio containing shipping manifests, witness statements, and financial records that would not only expose Ashworth but likely see him transported to Australia or worse. The scandal would rock London society to its foundations. As he entered Whitmore's, the familiar sense of leather, tobacco, and wood polish enveloped him. The club's interior, with its dark mahogany paneling and oil portraits of distinguished members past, exuded the comfortable masculinity that had made it a second home to generations of gentlemen. Alexander nodded to the porter and made his way toward the card-room, where he expected to find his quarry. Pemberton! The booming voice of Colonel Hartwell, a ruddy-faced veteran of the Indian campaigns, stopped him. "Join us for a rubber of whist?" "Perhaps later, Colonel. I have business to attend to first." Alexander's gaze swept the room until he spotted Ashworth holding court near the fireplace, regaling a small group with what was undoubtedly an embellished tale of his latest acquisition. The Earl cut an impressive figure, golden-haired, with the kind of classical features that had made him popular with the ladies of the ton. But Alexander now saw the calculating coldness behind those blue eyes, the subtle signs of a man who had grown comfortable with deception. Their eyes met across the room, and Ashworth's smile faltered for just a moment before reasserting itself with renewed brilliance. He excused himself from his audience and approached Alexander with the practised ease of a man accustomed to navigating treacherous social waters. "Pemberton, old fellow, what brings you out on such a dreadful evening?" Ashworth's voice carried its usual joviality, but Alexander detected an underlying tension. "Business, I'm afraid. Perhaps we might speak privately." Something flickered in Ashworth's eyes, wariness, calculation. "Of course. Shall we retire to the smoking-room?" The smoking-room, smaller and more intimate than the main lounge, provided the privacy Alexander required. Heavy velvet drapes blocked the outside world, and the air hung thick with the aroma of expensive tobacco. Alexander waited until they were alone before speaking. "I know about the opium, Reginald." The words hung in the air like smoke. Ashworth's face went through a rapid series of expressions: surprise, calculation, and finally, a cold mask of indifference. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." Alexander withdrew the leather portfolio from his jacket. "The warehouses in Wapping. The midnight shipments. The connections to the Celestial Dragon Syndicate. He placed the portfolio on the small table between them. It's all here, Reginald. Every sordid detail of your little empire. Ashworth's composure finally cracked. His face flushed, and his hands clenched into fists. You sanctimonious fool! Do you think your precious virtue will protect you from the realities of commerce? The government taxes are strangling legitimate trade. So you decided to circumvent them entirely, along with the laws against opium trafficking. Alexander's voice remained steady, but inside, his anger burned hot. He had seen the ravages of opium addiction in the East End, the broken families and destroyed lives. How many souls have you damned for your profit, Reginald? Spare me your moral indignation. Ashworth stood abruptly, pacing to the window. What do you want? Money. A cut of the operation. I want you to cease these activities immediately and turn yourself over to the authorities. Ashworth laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. You always were naive, Pemberton. Very well. You've made your position clear, and I've made mine. He moved toward the door. I trust you'll give me the courtesy of 24 hours to arrange my affairs before making this evidence public? Alexander studied his rival's face, seeing something dangerous lurking behind the facade of defeated resignation. But honor demanded he grant such a reasonable request. 24 hours. Gentleman to gentleman? You have my word. Ashworth nodded curtly and left the room, taking with him an atmosphere of barely contained menace that made Alexander's instincts prickle with unease. The Duke spent the remainder of the evening in careful preparation. He made copies of his evidence, secured them in his safe at Pemberton House, and sent discreet messages to certain contacts within Scotland Yard and the Home Office. By tomorrow evening he would present his case to the proper authorities, and Ashworth's criminal enterprise would crumble. But as midnight approached and Alexander prepared to depart for home, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had underestimated his opponent. The rain had intensified during his time at the club, turning the streets into rivers of reflection beneath the gas lamps. Alexander's carriage splashed through the empty thoroughfares of Mayfair, but as they approached the broader avenue that would take them toward Pemberton House in Belgravia, the Duke noticed his driver taking an unfamiliar route. Peters! Alexander called up to his coachman. This isn't the usual way. Begging your pardon, Your Grace, but there's been an accident on Park Lane. Police have it blocked off. We'll need to go round through the back streets. Something in the man's voice was wrong. Too tight, too nervous. Alexander had employed Peters for 5 years, and the coachman had never sounded so strained. The Duke's hand moved instinctively toward the walking stick at his side, its silver head concealing a blade that had proven useful during his military service in Afghanistan. The carriage turned into a narrow lane between tall warehouses, far from the fashionable districts where gaslight provided comfortable illumination. Here, shadows pooled like black water, and the only light came from the carriage lamps themselves. Peters, I insist we return to. The carriage lurched to a sudden halt, throwing Alexander forward. Before he could recover, the door was yanked open and rough hands seized him. 3 men, their faces hidden by cloth masks, dragged him from the carriage with ruthless efficiency. "Evening, Your Grace," growled one of them, his accent marking him as East End born. "Lord Ashworth sends his compliments." Alexander fought with the skill of a man who had faced Afghan tribesmen, his walking stick blade flashing in the dim light. He managed to wound one attacker before a blow from behind sent stars exploding across his vision. More hands grabbed him, and despite his struggles, sheer numbers overwhelmed him. They dragged him deeper into the alley, away from any chance of rescue. In the distance, Alexander could hear the sound of his carriage wheels retreating. Peters, either bought or coerced, abandoning him to his fate. "Ashworth's message is simple," the leader continued, producing a vicious-looking knife. "Withdraw your accusations, burn your evidence, or join the poor souls floating in the Thames come morning." Alexander spat blood and straightened as much as his captor's grip would allow. "Tell your master that the Duke of Pemberton does not yield to threats from common criminals." The knife glinted as it moved toward him. "Your Grace seems to misunderstand his situation." The blade sliced across Alexander's ribs, drawing a line of fire through his evening clothes. He gritted his teeth against the pain, refusing to give these thugs the satisfaction of hearing him cry out. But as the knife rose again, he realized that his honor and courage might cost him his life before he could expose Ashworth's crimes. The second cut, deeper than the first, opened a gash along his left arm. Blood soaked through his white shirt, dark in the lamplight. Alexander's vision blurred as pain and blood loss began to take their toll. "Perhaps your Grace would like to reconsider?" Through the haze of pain, Alexander managed a weak smile. "My answer remains the same." The leader snarled and raised his knife for what would surely be the killing blow. But as the blade descended, a voice rang out through the alley, clear, feminine, and utterly fearless. "Stop this instant!" Everyone froze, turning toward the unexpected interruption. At the mouth of the alley stood a young woman, her blonde hair gleaming like spun gold beneath a simple bonnet. She wore the practical dark dress and white apron of a nurse, and in her hands she carried a medical bag and a lantern that cast dancing shadows on the brick walls. "Miss, you'd best be moving along," the leader called out, though his voice had lost some of its menace. "This is no concern of yours." The woman stepped further into the alley, her lantern held high. "Any injured person is my concern, sir. I am Charlotte Whitmore, and I have just come from tending to the sick at St. Bartholomew's Hospital. Release that gentleman immediately." Alexander, despite his predicament, found himself captivated by this unexpected angel of mercy. Charlotte Whitmore possessed the kind of natural beauty that needed no enhancement from fashion or artifice. Her face, illuminated by the lantern's glow, showed classical features marked by intelligence and compassion. But it was her eyes that held him, clear blue, filled with a courage that seemed almost otherworldly given the circumstances. "This gentleman," the leader sneered, "is about to learn some manners. Now be off with you before you get hurt." Charlotte's expression hardened with determination. "I will not stand by and watch you murder an innocent man." She reached into her medical bag and produced a small bottle. "This contains concentrated laudanum, enough to cause serious harm if it contacts your eyes or mouth. Release him, or I shall be forced to defend both myself and my patient." The audacity of her threat seemed to stun the attackers momentarily. Here was a slip of a girl, no more than 23 by Alexander's estimation, facing down 3 armed thugs with nothing but a bottle of medicine and unwavering courage. But the leader recovered quickly, his voice turning ugly. "Grab her too. We'll dump them both in the river." As the nearest thug moved toward Charlotte, she proved that her threat was not mere bravado. The bottle's contents flew in a perfect arc, splashing across the man's face. His screams echoed off the alley walls as he clawed at his eyes, temporarily blinded and in agony. The distraction was all Alexander needed. Summoning his remaining strength, he broke free from his captor's loosened grip and launched himself at the leader. They crashed into the brick wall together, Alexander's military training proving superior to street thuggery despite his injuries. Charlotte, meanwhile, had produced another bottle from her seemingly bottomless medical bag. The third attacker, seeing his companions either incapacitated or engaged in combat, decided that discretion was the better part of valor and fled into the maze of London's back streets. The leader, bleeding from a broken nose courtesy of Alexander's fist, followed his subordinate's example. "This ain't over," he snarled as he retreated. "Lord Ashworth don't forget, and neither do we." As the sound of fleeing footsteps faded, Alexander sagged against the wall, adrenaline no longer masking the extent of his injuries. Charlotte was beside him instantly, her professional demeanor replacing the fierce protector of moments before. "You're bleeding quite badly," she murmured, opening her medical bag and retrieving clean bandages. "We need to get you somewhere I can properly tend these wounds." "Miss Whitmore," Alexander managed, his voice hoarse with pain and gratitude, "I owe you my life." She looked up from her examination of his injuries, and their eyes met in the lamplight. Something passed between them in that moment, a connection that neither could have expected or prepared for. Charlotte's cheeks flushed pink, but her voice remained steady. "You owe me nothing, sir. I merely did what anyone with medical training should do when confronted with violence." She helped him to his feet, supporting his weight with surprising strength for someone so slender. "My lodgings are nearby. I can treat you there properly." Under normal circumstances, propriety would have demanded that Alexander refuse such an offer. A gentleman simply did not accompany an unmarried young lady to her private rooms, regardless of the circumstances. But these were hardly normal circumstances, and Alexander found himself both too injured and too intrigued to object. Charlotte's lodgings proved to be a modest but scrupulously clean set of rooms above an apothecary shop in Bloomsbury. The sitting room was simply furnished but comfortable, with evidence of Charlotte's medical calling in the neat arrangement of books on anatomy and healing, as well as carefully organized supplies for her work. "Please sit here by the fire," Charlotte instructed, guiding him to a comfortable chair. "I need to examine those wounds properly." As she worked, cutting away his bloodied shirt and cleaning the knife cuts with practiced efficiency, Alexander studied his unexpected savior. Her movements were sure and competent, speaking of extensive training and experience. Most nurses he had encountered in his charitable work were older, often former servants who had learned their skills through necessity rather than formal education. "You're not like other nurses," he observed as she applied a particularly effective salve to his wounds. Charlotte paused in her work, meeting his gaze with a slight smile. "How many nurses have you encountered, mister?" Alexander realized he had not introduced himself properly. "Forgive me. Alexander Sinclair, Duke of Pemberton, at your service." If Charlotte was impressed by his title, she gave no sign. "Your Grace, then. And to answer your observation, you're correct. I am not like most nurses because I am not, strictly speaking, a nurse at all." This revelation intrigued Alexander. "Then what are you?" Charlotte resumed her work, wrapping his ribs with expert precision. "I am a physician, Your Grace. Or rather, I would be if the Royal College of Physicians recognized the medical degrees earned by women. As it stands, I must content myself with working as a nurse while practicing medicine to the best of my abilities." Alexander absorbed this information with growing respect. The few women he knew who had pursued medical training had faced enormous obstacles and social censure. That Charlotte had persevered spoke volumes about her character and determination. "You studied abroad, then?" "Paris, actually. The Sorbonne is more progressive than our institutions here." She finished her bandaging and stepped back to assess her work. "The wounds aren't deep enough to cause permanent damage, but you'll need to rest and allow them to heal properly. You've also lost a considerable amount of blood." Alexander tested the movement of his arm and found that Charlotte's ministrations had indeed provided significant relief. "Your skill is remarkable. I feel as though I've been attended by one of Harley Street's finest." Charlotte's cheeks colored again at the praise. "You flatter me, Your Grace. I speak only the truth." Alexander studied her face in the firelight, noting the intelligence in her blue eyes and the determined set of her jaw. "May I ask what brought you to that particular alley at such an opportune moment? It seems providential beyond mere chance." Charlotte busied herself with repacking her medical supplies, but Alexander sensed a deeper story behind her presence. "I was returning from St. Bartholomew's, where I volunteer my services in the charity ward. The direct route to my lodgings was blocked by some disturbance, so I took the back streets." She paused, her expression growing troubled. "I've been making that journey for months without incident, but lately the streets seem more dangerous. Alexander's mind, despite his injuries, was already working to piece together the implications. Ashworth's criminal network would naturally require enforcers and intimidation tactics to maintain their operations. The increased violence Charlotte had observed was likely connected to the very crimes he was preparing to expose. "Miss Whitmore, or should I say Dr. Whitmore, I fear you may have placed yourself in considerable danger by helping me tonight." Charlotte turned back to face him, her expression resolute. "I could hardly have done otherwise. But I sense there's more to this attack than simple robbery. Those men knew who you were, and their leader mentioned someone named Ashworth." Alexander was struck by her perceptiveness. Most young ladies of his acquaintance would have been too overwhelmed by the violence to notice such details. But Charlotte had remained alert and analytical even while facing mortal danger. "You're quite right. This was no random crime, but rather the opening gambit in what promises to be a deadly game." Alexander made a decision that went against every instinct of self-preservation he possessed. "Dr. Whitmore, I believe you deserve to know the full truth, as your involvement may have consequences for your own safety." Over the next hour, as the fire burned low and the rain continued its steady drumming against the windows, Alexander related the entire story of his investigation into Ashworth's criminal empire. Charlotte listened with the focused attention of a trained physician diagnosing a complex malady, asking occasional questions that demonstrated her quick grasp of the situation's implications. "So you see," Alexander concluded, "by saving my life tonight, you've placed yourself in opposition to some very dangerous people. I cannot, in good conscience, allow you to face such peril alone." Charlotte was quiet for a long moment, staring into the dying embers of the fire. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful but determined. "Your Grace, in my work at the hospital, I've seen the devastation wrought by opium addiction. Entire families destroyed, children left orphaned and destitute. If this Lord Ashworth is indeed profiting from such misery, then he must be stopped." "I agree completely, but the danger is something I accept." Charlotte's eyes blazed with righteous indignation. "You speak of conscience, Your Grace? My conscience would not allow me to step aside when I have the opportunity to help end such suffering." Alexander felt a surge of admiration for this remarkable woman who seemed to combine the healing touch of an angel with the courage of a warrior. But his protective instincts, heightened by the genuine feelings she was beginning to inspire in him, rebelled against the idea of placing her in harm's way. "Dr. Whitmore, I am deeply moved by your dedication to justice, but I cannot allow—" "With respect, Your Grace," Charlotte interrupted, her tone carrying a gentle but unmistakable firmness, "you cannot allow or disallow me to do anything. I am not a child or a dependent relative to be protected and controlled. I am a grown woman, a trained physician, and a citizen of England with every right to choose how I conduct my life." The rebuke was delivered with such grace and logic that Alexander found himself both chastened and even more impressed. He had been unconsciously falling into the trap of treating Charlotte as a fragile flower in need of masculine protection, when in fact she had already proven herself more capable and courageous than most men of his acquaintance. "You are absolutely correct, and I apologize for my presumption." Alexander inclined his head respectfully. "I merely hope to express my concern for your welfare, as someone who has already shown me extraordinary kindness." Charlotte's expression softened at his acknowledgment. "Your concern is appreciated, Your Grace, but misplaced. I have been navigating London's dangers for years while pursuing my medical calling. Tonight merely presented a more dramatic example of risks I face regularly." As if to underscore her point, the distant sound of breaking glass echoed from somewhere in the street below, followed by rough male voices and what sounded like a woman's scream. Charlotte moved to the window and carefully peered through the curtains. "Mrs. Patterson from the millinery shop," she murmured. "It appears she's being harassed by someone demanding payment for protection." Without hesitation, Charlotte moved toward her medical bag and began selecting certain bottles and instruments. "What are you doing?" Alexander asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Mrs. Patterson is 70 years old and suffers from a weak heart. If those men frighten her severely, it could kill her." Charlotte's voice was matter-of-fact as she prepared her medical supplies. "I'm going down to assist her." Alexander struggled to his feet despite the pain in his ribs. "Then I'm coming with you." "Absolutely not. You're injured and need to rest." "Dr. Whitmore, I may be injured, but I am hardly helpless. Besides, if these are more of Ashworth's people, my presence might convince them to seek easier prey." Charlotte studied his face, clearly seeing the determination there. After a moment, she nodded. "Very well, but promise me you'll retreat if the situation becomes too dangerous." "You're in no condition for another fight." They made their way carefully down the narrow stairs and out into the rain-soaked street. The scene before them was all too familiar. 3 rough-looking men surrounding an elderly woman while demanding money for protection against unnamed threats. Mrs. Patterson, a tiny figure in a worn shawl, was clearly terrified but trying to maintain her dignity. "Gentlemen," Alexander called out, his aristocratic voice carrying clearly through the night air, "I believe the lady has declined your offer." The men turned, recognizing a member of the upper classes despite Alexander's disheveled appearance. Their leader, a different man from those who had attacked Alexander earlier but cut from the same criminal cloth, scowled at the interruption. "This ain't your concern, Toff. Move along." Charlotte stepped forward, her medical bag prominent in her hands. "Mrs. Patterson, are you injured? You look quite pale." The elderly woman's face brightened with relief at seeing her kind neighbor. "Oh, Dr. Whitmore. These men are trying to make me pay them money, claiming it's for protection. But I can barely afford my rent as it is." "Protection from what, specifically?" Alexander inquired, his tone deceptively mild. The criminal leader laughed harshly. "From accidents, Your Grace. Terrible things can happen to defenseless old ladies in neighborhoods like this. Fires, break-ins, falls downstairs. Our services ensure such tragedies don't occur." The threat was thinly veiled, and Alexander felt his anger building despite his injuries. This was exactly the kind of intimidation and violence that Ashworth's network employed to maintain their criminal enterprises. Honest shopkeepers and residents were being terrorized to fund illegal activities. "How much are you demanding?" Alexander asked. £5 a month, the leader replied, clearly thinking he had found a wealthy mark willing to pay the old woman's tribute. Alexander reached into his jacket and withdrew his wallet. The criminal's eyes gleamed with avarice, but their expressions changed when Alexander handed the money not to them, but to Mrs. Patterson. "Madam, please consider this a loan to help with your rent and other expenses. I'm sure Dr. Whitmore can provide you with information about legal authorities who can address this harassment." The leader's face darkened with rage. "You're making a mistake, Your Grace. People who interfere with legitimate business arrangements often find themselves regretting it." "Are you threatening a peer of the realm?" Alexander's voice carried the steel of aristocratic authority, backed by centuries of noble privilege. "I suggest you consider the wisdom of that course very carefully." Charlotte, meanwhile, was helping Mrs. Patterson toward her shop. "Come along, dear. Let's get you inside where it's safe and warm." The criminals found themselves in an uncomfortable position. Assaulting a duke in broad view of witnesses would bring the full weight of Scotland Yard down upon them, but retreating without the protection money would show weakness to other potential victims. Their leader chose the path of face-saving bluster. "This neighborhood is under our protection, Your Grace. We can't be responsible for what happens to those who refuse our services." With that, they melted back into the shadows, but Alexander could sense their watching eyes. Ashworth's network was clearly extensive and well organized, able to deploy enforcers throughout London's poorer districts. Charlotte rejoined him after ensuring Mrs. Patterson was safely locked inside her shop. "That was well done, Your Grace, but I fear you've made yourself an even larger target." "Perhaps, but I couldn't stand by and watch an innocent woman be terrorized." Alexander looked around the rain-soaked street, noting how many darkened windows showed no signs of life despite the disturbance. Fear had driven the residents to hide rather than help their neighbor. This cannot be allowed to continue. As they made their way back to Charlotte's lodgings, Alexander's mind was working furiously. Ashworth's criminal empire was clearly more extensive than he had initially realized, reaching into every level of London society. The protection rackets, combined with the smuggling operation, suggested a criminal organization of considerable scope and ambition. "Dr. Whitmore," he said as they climbed the stairs to her rooms, "I fear I may have underestimated the extent of the corruption we're facing. This isn't merely a matter of avoiding taxes on luxury goods. Ashworth appears to be running a comprehensive criminal enterprise." Charlotte helped him settle back into the chair by the fire, which she quickly rekindled. "What do you intend to do? Surely the evidence you've gathered will be sufficient for the authorities." Alexander was quiet for a moment, considering the full implications of what they had witnessed tonight. "I'm beginning to wonder if the corruption might extend into the very authorities I had planned to approach. Ashworth's wealth and influence could have purchased protection at levels I hadn't considered." This possibility was deeply troubling. If Ashworth had managed to corrupt officials within Scotland Yard or even the Home Office, then simply presenting evidence might accomplish nothing beyond warning the criminals to destroy evidence and eliminate witnesses. Charlotte seemed to follow his train of thought. "Then what's your alternative?" "I need to gather more comprehensive evidence, enough to make the case undeniable even to corrupt officials. But more importantly, I need to identify trustworthy authorities who haven't been compromised." Alexander met Charlotte's eyes across the firelit room. "It's going to be dangerous work." "Then it's fortunate you have a partner," Charlotte said quietly. Alexander's heart quickened at her words, though he wasn't entirely sure whether his response was due to gratitude, concern, or the growing feelings this remarkable woman was inspiring in him. "Dr. Whitmore." "Charlotte," she corrected softly. "If we're to work together in such an enterprise, I believe we can dispense with excessive formality." "Charlotte, then. And you must call me Alexander." He paused, struck by the significance of what they were contemplating. "You understand this partnership could cost us both our lives?" Charlotte's smile was both gentle and determined. "Alexander, in my work at the hospital, I've learned that life without purpose is merely existence. Tonight, Providence placed me in that alley at exactly the moment you needed help. Perhaps this entire affair is meant to serve a greater purpose than either of us could achieve alone." Alexander found himself moved by her words and by the quiet faith they expressed. In his world of cynical politics and calculated social maneuvers, Charlotte's genuine idealism was both refreshing and inspiring. "Then we shall face whatever comes together," he said formally, extending his hand to her. Charlotte clasped his hand firmly, her touch sending an unexpected warmth through him. Partners in the pursuit of justice. But even as they sealed their pact, both were acutely aware of the dangers that lay ahead. Somewhere in London's maze of fashionable squares and squalid alleys, Lord Ashworth was undoubtedly planning his next move. The game had begun in earnest, and the stakes were nothing less than life and death. The following morning brought gray skies and a persistent drizzle that seemed to match Alexander's somber mood as he contemplated the task ahead. Charlotte had insisted he remain in her guest room overnight to ensure his injuries didn't reopen, and he had awakened to the sound of her moving efficiently about her small kitchen, preparing breakfast with the same competent grace she brought to her medical work. "Your color is much better this morning," she observed as she set a simple but nourishing meal before him. "The wounds are healing cleanly, with no signs of infection." Alexander marveled at how natural it felt to share this domestic scene with a woman he had known for less than 24 hours. There was something about Charlotte that put him at ease, allowing him to set aside the formal masks that his position usually required. "I owe my recovery to an exceptional physician," he replied, noting how the morning light streaming through her windows brought out golden highlights in her blonde hair. "Charlotte, I've been thinking about our situation. Ashworth will expect me to either flee London or capitulate to his demands. He won't anticipate a coordinated investigation." Charlotte poured herself a cup of tea and settled across from him at the small table. "What did you have in mind?" "We need to document not just the smuggling operation, but the entire network of corruption and intimidation. Last night's incident with Mrs. Patterson suggests the protection rackets are just as important to Ashworth's profits as the contraband trade. But how can we gather such evidence without exposing ourselves to further danger?" Alexander had spent much of the sleepless night pondering this very question. "I believe the key lies in approaching the problem from multiple angles. While I continue investigating the financial and shipping aspects of the operation, you could focus on the street-level effects. Your work at the hospital puts you in contact with victims of both the violence and the addiction that Ashworth's network creates." Charlotte nodded thoughtfully. "I've treated several patients whose injuries were clearly the result of beatings from debt collectors or protection enforcers. And the opium addicts, their numbers have increased dramatically in recent months." "Exactly. If we can document the pattern of injuries and correlate them with the expansion of Ashworth's operations, we'll have evidence that even corrupt officials will find difficult to ignore." Their planning was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Charlotte and Alexander exchanged wary glances, both thinking of the previous night's threats. Charlotte moved to the window and carefully peered down at the street below. "It's a young boy," she reported. "He appears to be carrying a message." Alexander's first instinct was caution. Ashworth's network could easily employ children as messengers or spies. But Charlotte was already moving toward the door, her natural compassion overriding prudent suspicion. The boy on her doorstep couldn't have been more than 12, thin and poorly dressed, but with intelligent eyes that spoke of street wisdom beyond his years. He clutched a sealed envelope in one grubby hand. "Beggin' your pardon, miss, but I was told to deliver this to the Duke of Pemberton. Gentleman said he'd be here." Alexander appeared at Charlotte's shoulder, immediately recognizing the expensive stationery and elegant seal. The message was from Ashworth. "Here's a sixpence for your trouble, lad," Alexander said, pressing the coin into the boy's hand. "Did the gentleman who gave you this message say anything else?" The boy pocketed the coin with practiced swiftness. "Only that you'd know what it meant, your grace. Oh, and that there'd be more messages coming if you didn't give the right answer to this one." After the boy scampered away, Alexander and Charlotte examined the envelope. The seal was unbroken, but both were acutely aware that opening it would reveal their location to Ashworth. "He already knows where we are," Alexander said grimly. "The question is whether he's testing our resolve or preparing to escalate his threats." Charlotte's expression was troubled but determined. "There's only one way to find out." Alexander broke the seal and unfolded the heavy paper within. The message was brief but chilling in its implications. "My dear Pemberton, I trust your evening constitutional provided adequate exercise and fresh air. London streets can be so dangerous after dark, particularly for those who venture into neighborhoods where they don't belong. I find myself reconsidering our earlier conversation and wondering if perhaps we might reach a more mutually beneficial arrangement. There are, after all, many ways for enterprising gentlemen to profit from the current uncertainties in international trade. I shall be hosting a small gathering tomorrow evening at Blackmoor House. Perhaps you would care to attend? We could discuss various business opportunities that might interest a man of your flexible, moral principles. Your devoted friend, Ashworth. P.S. Please do extend my compliments to your charming companion. I'm told she has quite remarkable medical skills. The postscript sent a chill through both readers. Ashworth knew about Charlotte's role in the previous night's events, which meant his surveillance network was even more extensive than they had feared. "He's trying to draw you out," Charlotte observed, though her voice was steady despite the implied threat. "This invitation is clearly a trap." Alexander nodded grimly. "But it also represents an opportunity. If Ashworth is gathering his associates for this meeting, we might be able to identify the full scope of his organization." "You're not seriously considering attending?" "Actually, I am." Alexander began pacing the small room, his strategic mind working through the possibilities. "Ashworth expects me to either flee or cower in hiding. He won't anticipate a direct confrontation on his own territory." Charlotte moved to intercept his pacing, placing a firm hand on his arm. "Alexander, this is precisely what he wants. You'll be walking into a house full of criminals with no backup and no means of escape." "Not necessarily." Alexander covered her hand with his own, struck by the warmth of her touch and the genuine concern in her eyes. "What if we could turn his trap against him? Use this gathering as an opportunity to document his entire network." Charlotte studied his face intently. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Ashworth's arrogance is his weakness. He believes he's demonstrated his power over me, and now he wants to recruit me into his organization. If I play the role of a defeated aristocrat seeking profit over principle, he might reveal information that would otherwise take months to uncover." "And how do you propose to document this information while surrounded by criminals?" Alexander smiled at her practical question. "That's where your medical expertise becomes invaluable. Among your supplies, do you have anything that could serve as a recording device?" Charlotte looked puzzled for a moment, then her expression cleared. "You mean stenographic equipment?" "I do have a small notebook and special pencils I use for taking detailed patient notes. The writing is nearly invisible unless you know how to develop it." "Perfect. But more importantly, I'll need someone positioned outside the house who can observe the comings and goings, document who attends this gathering, and most critically, summon help if things go wrong." Charlotte's eyes widened as she realized what he was suggesting. "You want me to conduct surveillance on Blackmore House while you're inside? You know the city's medical facilities and staff. If we encounter violence, you'll be able to coordinate with trustworthy doctors and perhaps even some of the more honest police officials. Additionally, your medical bag provides perfect cover for being in any neighborhood at any hour." Charlotte was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing the risks and possibilities. Finally, she nodded slowly. "It could work, but we'll need more detailed planning. And contingencies if everything goes wrong." Over the next several hours, they developed their strategy with the thoroughness of military commanders planning a campaign. Alexander would attend Ashworth's gathering in the role of a pragmatic aristocrat willing to join the criminal enterprise for financial gain. Charlotte would establish herself in a position to observe the house, document attendees, and maintain communication with select allies who could provide assistance if needed. The plan was dangerous, but it offered their best hope of gathering comprehensive evidence against Ashworth's organization. More importantly, it would allow them to identify the full scope of the criminal network before it could adapt to their investigation. As evening approached, Alexander prepared for his performance. Charlotte helped him dress his wounds with fresh bandages that wouldn't show through his evening clothes, and they rehearsed the persona he would adopt, a defeated aristocrat whose principles had been shaken by economic pressures and personal threats. "Remember," Charlotte said as she adjusted his cravat, "Ashworth will be watching for any sign that you're playing a role. Your natural arrogance will actually serve you well here. Let him think you're simply adapting your superior attitude to a new reality." Alexander caught her hands as she finished her ministrations, struck by how natural it felt to have her caring for him in such an intimate way. "Charlotte, if anything goes wrong tonight—" "It won't," she interrupted firmly. "We've planned for every contingency, and we both know the stakes. You'll play your part perfectly, and I'll be watching over you." The confidence in her voice was reassuring, but Alexander couldn't shake a growing awareness that his feelings for Charlotte had evolved far beyond mere gratitude or partnership. The thought of placing her in danger was becoming increasingly difficult to bear. "There's something else I need to say," he began hesitantly. "These past 2 days have shown me qualities in you that I've never encountered in another person. Your courage, your compassion, your remarkable intelligence." Charlotte's cheeks flushed pink, but she didn't pull away from his grasp. "Alexander, perhaps this conversation should wait until after we've completed tonight's work?" He nodded, understanding her practical wisdom even as his heart urged him to speak. "You're right, of course. But Charlotte, I want you to know that whatever happens tonight, meeting you has changed my life in ways I never expected." She squeezed his hands gently. "And mine as well. Now, shall we proceed to save London from Lord Ashworth's criminal empire?" Blackmore House stood like a Georgian fortress in the heart of Mayfair, its elegant facade concealing the corruption within. Alexander approached on foot, having dismissed his replacement carriage several blocks away to avoid providing Ashworth's people with information about his transportation. The evening fog was beginning to roll in from the Thames, providing convenient cover for Charlotte's surveillance position in the garden square across from the mansion. The butler who answered Alexander's knock was clearly not a typical domestic servant. His powerful build and alert eyes marked him as one of Ashworth's enforcers dressed for the occasion. But his manner was properly deferential as he ushered Alexander into the opulent entry hall. "His lordship is expecting you in the library, Your Grace." Alexander followed the man through corridors lined with expensive artwork, noting details that might prove useful later. The house was clearly designed to impress visitors with Ashworth's wealth and taste, but Alexander's trained eye spotted telltale signs of recent acquisition. Paintings hung slightly askew, furniture arrangements that lacked the settled familiarity of long residence. The library where Ashworth waited was a study in calculated intimidation. Dark leather volumes lined the walls from floor to ceiling, while heavy furniture and dim lighting created an atmosphere of masculine power. A fire crackled in the ornate fireplace, casting dancing shadows across Persian carpets and polished wood surfaces. Ashworth himself stood beside the mantelpiece, a glass of what appeared to be excellent brandy in his hand. He had clearly chosen his position to present the most commanding figure possible, backlit by the fire and elevated slightly on the hearth. "Pemberton, how good of you to accept my invitation." Ashworth's voice carried exactly the right note of triumphant magnanimity. "I trust your recent adventures haven't left any lasting effects?" Alexander forced himself to adopt the bearing of a man whose pride had been broken, but not his fundamental arrogance. "Nothing that time won't heal, I'm sure." "Excellent. Brandy?" "This particular vintage is a recent acquisition, quite literally, as it happens. The original owner found himself unable to meet certain financial obligations." The casual reference to stolen goods was clearly intended to gauge Alexander's reaction. He accepted the offered glass and took an appreciative sip, allowing a slight smile to cross his features. "Your associates are quite persuasive, I'll grant them that. They've helped me see certain realities that I had perhaps been too naive to recognize previously." Ashworth's smile broadened with genuine satisfaction. "Pragmatism is the hallmark of true intelligence, my dear fellow. Idealistic principles are luxuries that practical men cannot afford." As they spoke, Alexander became aware of voices from other parts of the house. Ashworth's gathering was clearly larger than a simple dinner party, with multiple conversations taking place in different rooms. This could provide valuable intelligence about the scope of the criminal organization. "I confess," Alexander continued, playing his role carefully, "that recent events have forced me to reconsider many of my previous assumptions about commerce and ethics. Perhaps there are opportunities I've been overlooking." "Now you're speaking sensibly." Ashworth moved to pour himself another brandy, clearly pleased with Alexander's apparent conversion. "The world is changing, Pemberton. Those who adapt will prosper, while those who cling to outdated notions of honor and duty will find themselves left behind." Alexander noted how easily Ashworth spoke of abandoning honor, confirming his assessment of the man's character. "What sort of opportunities did you have in mind?" "All in good time. First, I'd like you to meet some associates of mine. Gentlemen who share our pragmatic approach to modern business." Ashworth led Alexander through a series of interconnected reception rooms, each containing small groups of well-dressed men engaged in quiet but intense conversations. Alexander recognized several faces: members of Parliament, shipping merchants, even a senior clerk from the customs house. The scope of Ashworth's corruption was staggering. In the main drawing room, Alexander found himself introduced to nearly 24 men representing various levels of London's political and commercial hierarchy. Some he knew by reputation as respected figures in society, while others were clearly from less savory backgrounds despite their expensive clothes. "Gentlemen," Ashworth announced, "I'm pleased to present our newest associate, the Duke of Pemberton. His Grace has recently come to appreciate the advantages of our approach to international trade." The assembled group greeted Alexander with a mixture of deference and calculation that marked men accustomed to converting social connections into profit. As conversations resumed around him, Alexander began to understand the true genius of Ashworth's operation. This wasn't simply a smuggling ring, but rather a comprehensive corruption network that touched every aspect of London's commercial life. Customs officials provided advance warning of inspections, parliamentarians shaped legislation to benefit criminal enterprises, and respected merchants provided legitimate fronts for illegal activities. The protection rackets Alexander had observed were merely the street-level enforcement arm of a much larger conspiracy. "Fascinating system you've developed," Alexander murmured to Ashworth during a quiet moment. "The integration of legitimate business with alternative revenue streams is quite sophisticated." Ashworth preened at the compliment. "Years in development, I assure you. The key is maintaining the appearance of respectability while maximizing profit opportunities that more conventional businessmen overlook." As the evening progressed, Alexander was given increasingly detailed information about various aspects of the operation. Maps were produced showing shipping routes and warehouse locations, financial ledgers demonstrated the scale of profits being generated, and personnel rosters revealed the extent of corruption within government agencies. Alexander memorized every detail while maintaining his pose of interested conversion to Ashworth's philosophy. The evidence being presented was far more comprehensive than anything he could have gathered through months of independent investigation. But as the night wore on, Alexander became increasingly aware that something was wrong. Ashworth's revelations were too complete, too detailed for a recruitment meeting. No criminal organization would expose so much sensitive information to a new member, particularly one whose loyalty was suspect. The realization hit him with chilling clarity. This wasn't recruitment, it was a different kind of trap entirely. Ashworth was documenting Alexander's presence at the gathering, his apparent participation in criminal planning, and his acceptance of detailed information about illegal activities. The Earl was creating evidence that could be used to destroy Alexander's reputation and credibility should he ever attempt to expose the criminal network. Alexander's training in Afghanistan had taught him to recognize when a tactical situation was deteriorating beyond recovery. Every instinct screamed at him to find an exit before Ashworth's real purpose became clear to the other conspirators. "Gentlemen," Ashworth called for attention as the evening's formal presentations concluded, "I believe it's time for our newest member to demonstrate his commitment to our enterprise." The room fell silent, and Alexander felt the weight of nearly 30 pairs of eyes focused on him. Whatever test Ashworth had prepared, it would likely be designed to compromise Alexander beyond any possibility of redemption. "What did you have in mind?" Alexander kept his voice steady despite the growing sense of danger. Ashworth smiled with predatory satisfaction. "Nothing too demanding for your first assignment. Simply a small task to demonstrate that your conversion to pragmatism is genuine rather than opportunistic." A door at the far end of the room opened, and two of Ashworth's enforcers entered, dragging between them a man whose bruised face and torn clothing spoke of recent violence. Alexander's blood ran cold as he recognized the prisoner. Thompson, his own man of affairs, the one person who knew the complete details of Alexander's investigation. Mr. Thompson here has been asking uncomfortable questions about shipping manifests and warehouse ownership, Ashworth explained conversationally. Quite naturally, this has caused some concern among our associates. We need to ensure his discretion. The implication was unmistakable. Ashworth was demanding that Alexander personally silence the one witness who could corroborate his evidence against the criminal network. It was a masterstroke of manipulation. Either Alexander would compromise himself irrevocably by participating in violence against his own employee, or he would reveal his true purpose and face the combined wrath of 30 criminals with no hope of escape. Alexander's mind raced through possibilities, but every scenario ended in disaster. He was trapped in a house full of enemies, with no weapon and no allies, faced with an impossible choice between dishonor and death. Outside in the foggy garden square, Charlotte maintained her vigil despite growing anxiety about the length of Alexander's absence. Her medical bag sat beside her on the park bench, its contents carefully arranged for any emergency that might arise. She had documented the arrival of nearly 3 dozen men at Blackmore House, including several she recognized from newspaper illustrations as prominent political figures. But something felt wrong about the evening's progression. The gathering had settled into a pattern that suggested a lengthy meeting, with servants moving efficiently between rooms and no signs of the social circulation typical of a normal party. More troubling still, several of the men who had arrived early in the evening had departed through a side entrance, their faces grim and their manner suggesting urgent business elsewhere. Charlotte's medical training had taught her to trust her instincts when diagnosing complex conditions, and every instinct now told her that Alexander was in mortal danger. The question was whether she could provide meaningful assistance without compromising their entire mission. As if in answer to her concerns, a small figure detached itself from the shadows near the house's servant entrance. Charlotte recognized the boy who had delivered Ashworth's message that morning, and his presence here could hardly be coincidental. She approached him carefully, maintaining the appearance of a medical professional making her rounds. "Good evening, young man. Are you feeling well? You look rather pale." The boy glanced around nervously before responding in a whisper. "Miss, if you're the lady what's watching out for that Duke fellow, he's in terrible trouble in there." Charlotte's heart jumped, but she kept her voice calm. "What kind of trouble?" "They've got his man Thompson all beaten up, and they're making the Duke choose between hurting Thompson himself or— well, they didn't say exactly, but it won't be pleasant." This was the nightmare scenario Charlotte and Alexander had planned for but hoped to avoid. Alexander was trapped inside the house, facing an impossible situation with no apparent means of escape. "Is there another way into the house?" Charlotte asked urgently. The boy nodded. "Servants' entrance is usually locked, but I know where they keep the key. Cook sometimes gives me scraps, so I know the layout inside." Charlotte made a decision that went against every principle of caution they had established. "Show me." Within minutes, Charlotte was creeping through the darkened servants' corridors of Blackmore House, guided by a streetwise 12-year-old who moved through the shadows with practiced ease. Her medical bag, supplemented with several carefully selected chemical compounds from her lodgings, provided the tools she hoped could tip the balance in Alexander's favor. The boy led her to a position just outside the drawing-room where the confrontation was taking place. Through a crack in the door, Charlotte could see Alexander standing in the center of a circle of well-dressed criminals, facing the beaten form of a man she assumed was Thompson. "The choice is quite simple, Pemberton," Ashworth was saying. "Demonstrate your commitment to our organization by ensuring Mr. Thompson's permanent silence, or face the consequences of your deception." Alexander's voice, when he replied, carried a note of aristocratic disdain that Charlotte recognized as genuine rather than performed. "You're asking me to murder my own employee to prove my loyalty to a criminal enterprise. Even if I were inclined toward such pragmatism, the logic seems flawed." "Oh, but the logic is perfect," Ashworth replied with oily satisfaction. "You see, we've been aware of your true purpose since yesterday morning. Your investigation, your evidence-gathering, even your charming medical companion, all known to us from the beginning." Charlotte felt her blood turn to ice. If Ashworth had been aware of their activities, then this entire evening was an elaborate execution disguised as recruitment. "You've been quite thorough," Alexander acknowledged, his tone remaining steady despite the revelation. "But if you've known all along, why this elaborate charade?" "Because, my dear Duke, we needed evidence of your criminal activities to neutralize any accusations you might level against us. Tonight's gathering has provided ample documentation of your willing participation in our discussions. Your presence here, your apparent acceptance of criminal profits, your knowledge of our operations, all witnessed by some of London's most respectable citizens." The full scope of Ashworth's trap was now clear. Whether Alexander chose violence or defiance, the criminal network had positioned itself to destroy his credibility and reputation. Any attempt to expose them would be met with counter-accusations backed by the testimony of dozens of witnesses. Charlotte realized that conventional rescue was impossible. There were simply too many enemies in too confined a space. But her medical training suggested an alternative approach that might level the playing field. Working quickly and silently, she began preparing a combination of chemicals from her medical supplies. Chloral hydrate, used in small doses as a sedative, became something far more potent when combined with certain other compounds. The mixture, when dispersed through the house's heating system, would render most of the occupants unconscious within minutes. The risk was enormous. Too much of the compound could prove fatal, while too little would merely alert the criminals to her presence. But with Alexander facing imminent death or dishonor, calculated risks were preferable to certain disaster. As Charlotte worked, the confrontation in the drawing-room was reaching its climax. "Your silence, Mr. Thompson," Ashworth continued, "represents the only remaining threat to our organization. The Duke's cooperation in eliminating that threat will ensure his own survival and provide us with the leverage needed to guarantee his future discretion." Thompson, despite his injuries, managed to raise his head and look directly at Alexander. "Your Grace, whatever they've threatened, don't compromise your honor for my sake. Some things matter more than survival." The quiet dignity of the man's words seemed to steel Alexander's resolve. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of generations of noble breeding. "Lord Ashworth, you've made a fundamental error in your calculations. You assume that fear of death or disgrace will overcome a gentleman's principles. But there are indeed some things that matter more than survival." Alexander moved closer to Thompson, and for a moment it appeared he might actually comply with Ashworth's demand. But instead of violence, he began helping the injured man to his feet. "Mr. Thompson has served my family faithfully for 15 years. If you require his life, you'll have to take mine as well." The room erupted in angry voices as the criminals realized their elaborate trap was failing. Several men moved toward Alexander and Thompson, while others began arguing about how to salvage the situation. It was at this moment that Charlotte's chemical intervention took effect. The sleeping compound, introduced through the house's heating ducts, began to disperse throughout the building in an invisible cloud. Within seconds, the angry voices in the drawing-room began to slur and fade as one by one, Ashworth's associates succumbed to the powerful sedative. Alexander, warned by Charlotte's earlier briefing to breathe through the cloth she had provided for such emergencies, remained conscious as chaos descended around him. Thompson, weakened by his injuries, was among the first to collapse, but harmlessly into sleep rather than violence. Ashworth himself, perhaps warned by some survival instinct, managed to stagger toward a window before the compound overwhelmed him. But his final act of defiance was to pull a concealed pistol from his evening jacket. "If I can't have your cooperation, Pemberton, I'll settle for your death." The shot echoed through the now silent house, but Alexander had anticipated the desperate move. He threw himself aside, feeling the bullet tear through his jacket sleeve as he rolled behind a heavy sofa. Charlotte burst through the door at that moment, her medical bag in one hand and a police whistle in the other. The shrill sound cut through the night air, summoning the constables she had positioned at strategic points around the neighborhood. "Alexander, are you injured?" "Superficially only," he called back, emerging from cover as Ashworth finally succumbed to the chemical compound and collapsed unconscious. "Your timing was perfect." Within minutes, the drawing-room was filled with police constables taking statements and securing evidence. Alexander's portfolio, combined with the comprehensive documentation Ashworth had foolishly provided during the evening's presentations, created an overwhelming case against the entire criminal network. As Charlotte tended to Thompson's injuries and supervised the medical care of the unconscious conspirators, Alexander found himself marveling at the remarkable woman who had not only saved his life twice, but had single-handedly brought down one of London's most sophisticated criminal enterprises. "Dr. Whitmore," he said formally as the immediate crisis passed, "I believe we've successfully completed our mission." Charlotte looked up from her patient, her hair disheveled and her dress stained with various medical compounds, but her eyes bright with satisfaction. "Indeed we have, Your Grace. Lord Ashworth's empire appears to be at an end." The weeks that followed brought a transformation to London's criminal underworld as Ashworth's network crumbled under the weight of evidence and testimony. The Earl himself, along with most of his major associates, faced transportation to Australia under sentences of hard labor. The protection rackets disappeared overnight, allowing honest shopkeepers like Mrs. Patterson to operate without fear. But for Alexander and Charlotte, the most significant transformation was personal rather than societal. What had begun as a partnership born of necessity had evolved into something far deeper and more lasting. On a crisp autumn morning 6 weeks after the confrontation at Blackmore House, Alexander waited nervously in the drawing-room of his Belgravia mansion. He had spent considerable time that morning ensuring his appearance was perfect, though he suspected Charlotte would be more interested in his character than his clothes. When she was announced and entered the room, Alexander felt his breath catch as it had that first night in the alley. Charlotte wore a simple but elegant blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes, and her blonde hair was arranged in the latest fashion. But it was the intelligence and warmth in her expression that truly captured his attention. "Your Grace," she said with a slight curtsy that managed to be both proper and slightly mocking. "Your message suggested you had something important to discuss?" Alexander had rehearsed this conversation numerous times, but faced with Charlotte's presence, his carefully planned words seemed inadequate. "Charlotte, these past weeks have convinced me of something I began to suspect during our first adventure together." She raised an eyebrow inquiringly, though Alexander thought he detected a hint of anticipation in her expression. "I find myself in the unprecedented situation of having fallen completely and irrevocably in love with a woman who is not only more courageous than most men of my acquaintance, but considerably more intelligent than I am." Charlotte's cheeks flushed pink, but her smile was radiant. "Alexander, surely you don't expect me to argue with such an accurate assessment?" Alexander laughed, feeling the tension that had plagued him for days finally beginning to ease. "I had hoped you might be willing to consider a proposal that would make such disparities in courage and intelligence a permanent arrangement." He moved closer to her, taking her hands in his as he had that night in her lodgings when they first planned their campaign against Ashworth. "Charlotte Whitmore, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Charlotte's answer was everything he had dared hope for and more. "Alexander Sinclair, I thought you would never ask." Their engagement caused a considerable sensation in London society. The Duke of Pemberton's choice of a bride who was not only untitled but actually employed in medicine shocked many of the Ton's more conservative members. But Alexander's heroic role in exposing Ashworth's criminal network had made him something of a popular hero, and Charlotte's courage in assisting him had captured the public imagination. More importantly, those who knew them best recognized that the Duke and his future Duchess were perfectly matched in intelligence, principle, and strength of character. Their wedding, held on a snowy December morning in St. George's, Hanover Square, was attended by everyone from street children who had been helped by Charlotte's medical charity work to cabinet ministers who had benefited from Alexander's exposure of government corruption. As they exchanged vows before the altar, both Alexander and Charlotte reflected on the providential circumstances that had brought them together. A chance encounter in a dark alley had blossomed into a partnership that had not only brought justice to London streets but had given them both the love they had never expected to find. The reception at Pemberton House was a celebration that bridged every level of London society. Mrs. Patterson, resplendent in a new dress purchased with the money Alexander had given her, chatted comfortably with members of Parliament. Street children who had served as Charlotte's messengers during their investigation mingled with peers of the realm. Thompson, fully recovered from his injuries and promoted to senior partner in Alexander's business affairs, gave a toast that brought tears to many eyes. But perhaps the most moving moment came when the young boy who had guided Charlotte through Blackmore House on that crucial night approached the newlyweds during the reception. "Your Grace, Your Grace," he said formally, having clearly practiced the proper address. "I wanted to thank you both for what you did. My sister was one of them, addicted to the opium, and she's getting better now that the bad men are gone." Charlotte knelt to the boy's level, her wedding dress pooling around her on the floor. "What's your name?" "Tommy, Your Grace." "Tommy Fletcher." "Well, Tommy Fletcher, the Duke and I have been discussing the need for someone to help coordinate our charitable work in the East End. Someone who knows the streets and the people, and who can be trusted with important responsibilities. Would you be interested in such a position?" Tommy's eyes widened with amazement and gratitude. "You mean a real job? With wages and everything?" Alexander joined his wife at the boy's level. "Real wages, real responsibilities, and real opportunities to help people who need it most. What do you say?" Tommy's acceptance was enthusiastic and immediate, but as the boy ran off to share his good fortune with friends, Charlotte and Alexander found themselves reflecting on the larger implications of their victory over Ashworth's network. "We've won an important battle," Charlotte said thoughtfully as they stood together in the garden behind Pemberton House, "but the war against such corruption will never truly end." Alexander nodded, understanding her meaning completely. "Then we'll face each new challenge as we faced this one, together with courage and with the conviction that justice ultimately triumphs over greed." Charlotte smiled and leaned against her new husband, feeling the strength and warmth that had sustained them through their most dangerous moments. Together, then. Always. As they stood in their garden, surrounded by the sound of celebration and the promise of future adventures, both Alexander and Charlotte knew that their love story was only beginning. The criminal network they had destroyed would eventually be replaced by others, and London streets would continue to need guardians willing to fight for justice and truth. But whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them as they had faced Ashworth, as partners, as lovers, and as two souls perfectly matched in their determination to make the world a better place. In the gaslight and shadows of Victorian London, they had found not only love, but a shared purpose that would sustain them through whatever adventures lay ahead. The Duke and Duchess of Pemberton's story had become legend in London society, the tale of how a chance encounter in a dark alley had blossomed into a love that conquered both crime and convention. But for Alexander and Charlotte themselves, it was simply the beginning of a lifetime spent in service to justice, to each other, and to the belief that even in the darkest corners of the world, love and courage could triumph over any evil. As the last guests departed and the newlyweds retired to their chambers, both reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. From that first night when Charlotte had saved Alexander's life in the alley to their final confrontation with Ashworth's criminal empire, they had discovered that some partnerships are truly meant to last forever. And in the years that followed, as they continued their work to improve the lives of London's most vulnerable citizens, the Duke and Duchess of Pemberton would prove that the greatest love stories are not merely about romance, but about two people who inspire each other to become the best versions of themselves while making the world a better place for everyone around them. Their legacy would endure long after their individual stories had ended, a testament to the power of love, courage, and unwavering principle to overcome any obstacle and triumph over any darkness. In the end, Alexander and Charlotte had not only saved each other, but had shown all of London that true nobility lies not in titles or wealth, but in the willingness to fight for justice and to love without reservation.